Nickelodeon.
From Nickelodeon Studios in Burbank, California, this is the Nickelodeon Animation Podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Hector Navarro. Welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is a really, really special one. He's an Academy and Annie award-winning director, producer, writer, animator, who's known for directing some of Pixar's best films. Starting at the company at age 21, he was the 10th employee ever hired, the 3rd ever animator, and has since become an essential member of the senior creative team. It is my distinct pleasure to get to introduce to you guys Mr. Pete Docter. Thank you so much for joining us from up in Pixar. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm sitting up here in the development building. I was just up working on whatever it is that I'm working on now.
Which it sounds like you can't say, but I'm going to try my darndest to get something out of you.
Okay.
All right. So when did you become a storyteller?
A lot of times people talk about, story is most important, and it definitely is. But my venue into this whole thing was technique. I was fascinated by flip books, the idea that you could have these little still images, and when they are flipped in succession, they look like they're moving, they're alive, and then, as you get better, you realize, you can kind of create the illusion these characters are thinking, that they have a life, and so that was my door into this idea of using technology, cameras and things like this to make this stuff look alive. And then I realized, if it's just moving, people are bored after a little while. So it makes more sense to them and is more fun when it has a kind of a cute joke or something. And that led from one thing to another. And I went to CalArts, the California Institute of the Arts. And one of the great things there was, in addition to all the classes, one of the requirements is you make your own short film. And so I had made a bunch of my own at home, which were basically rip-offs of other cartoons I'd seen, which I think is a necessary step, But these were a chance for me to kind of do what I wanted and make my own films and put them up there and watch them fail or succeed in different ways. And I learned a ton from those.
Yeah. What kind of stuff did you learn from that?
The main thing for me was the opportunity to put these up in front of audiences. And first of all, it's just your buddies. And then ultimately, it's like screening it in a large room full of people and just experiencing. And of course, at that moment, your heart is going a million miles an hour. The adrenaline is up because this is the result of months of work to show just these couple minutes, right? So you have all this built up pressure and you're just like listening, you're hoping for laughs and then nothing. Oh, but there's a laugh there. Okay, I'll take it. And then you start to, even as you're watching, you're like, if I had milked that for just another second or a couple more frames, it could have been funnier. So it really hones your sense of how to communicate and what's going to work and what doesn't. I think it's essential. I remember reading an interview of Steve Martin, and he was talking about working with this director, Frank Oz. Now, if you know Frank Oz, he is the guy who created Miss Piggy and Grover, and he had put in hundreds of hours of appearing in front of an audience through his puppetry. And Steve Martin said, who is this guy and how does he have such sharp comedy instincts? And I think it's exactly because of all that time that he put in. I love the opportunity that all the web stuff allows for people because you can put stuff out there and it's seen. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. But you don't get to see people's reaction to it, There's no substitute for sitting in an audience full of people and hearing what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a big Muppets guy. I heard you were as well. Who's your favorite Muppet?
Ooh, I think I relate most to Fozzie, where there's this, like I say, a sense of insecurity. Like he has that great, I'm funny. And then there's the insecurity. Oh, I suck. And I run away and hide.
Along with the Muppets, what kind of stuff did you love as a kid? Did you have a favorite movie or TV show growing up?
There was I think they were desperate for programming, and they took all the Warner Brothers cartoons and put them on Saturday mornings, and that's what I grew up on. The Bugs Bunny. It got so pretty early on I could recognize, wait, that's Chuck Jones, and that's Frisk Freeling. I could kind of tell style and timing and things like that. But yeah, I learned a ton from those.
Was there ever a plan for you that wasn't, I'm going to work in the field of animation or in another field where you're like, I might want to try this?
Yeah. growing up, I really had no thought about responsible things like how am I going to earn a living. It was just, I like doing this. Right now, I'm having fun making these shorts. And I guess I sort of dreamt of, because, I was lucky enough that my films got in the Mike and Spike Festival of Animation, which is how I got to see it with a live audience often. And there were all these amazing filmmakers, Canadian, Yugoslavian, people from around the world who I think live in shacks, because it's not like a way to make a ton of dough. But they obviously make these great masterpieces. And that's what I pictured myself doing, not really thinking about the financials of it at all. Just I thought, shorts are awesome. I wanted to do this.
Is that part of the reason, coupled with your interest and love of technology, that you ended up choosing to work at Pixar?
Yeah, it was, well, for one, I credit my mother. I was born in a good year. Prior to 1990-ish, the animation was in a big slump. And there was pretty much, for a long time, I know people graduating from CalArts, they could look forward to a promising career doing in-betweens on He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, or some kind of semi-schlocky looking thing. And when I came out, The Simpsons was starting up, and Disney was starting up with Little Mermaid, and so it was a really great time. So a lot of this is luck. But there was a lot of opportunity, and I think it was mainly because of the short films that even though all these things, like if you'd rewound maybe 4 years, I would have pictured myself going to Disney or maybe even Simpsons, something like that.
Sure.
But it was between the technology, which fascinated me, and then meeting the people at Pixar that just made me go, yep, that's the place. I don't know where they're going.
Yeah.
There's no real talk of a feature at that time.
Sure.
It was all the short films. And they were just starting to do commercials, which is how I got hired.
What kind of commercials did you work on?
Let's see. The first one I did was a Listerine boxing commercial. It was sort of a send-up of, a Raging Bull or something like this. A little bottle of Listerine boxing against the camera. And then, let's see, we did Lifesavers and Tropicana, a bunch of different things. And those were really cool because I feel like, in a way, you read about the Nine Old Men talking about how the short films were their training ground. They really learned a lot by just cranking out these shorts. The commercials for us were kind of like that because you realized we've got to cram all this story that we've come up with in 30 seconds, not a frame more or less, and it has to sell the product. So it was really like a lot of good constraints for us.
Yeah.
Which a lot of times we should talk about constraints too, because I think people sometimes have misunderstanding about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I don't think people really understand, like you said, there's misunderstandings about constraints, but how can constraints help storytelling?
I was making a short film, which is sitting in my garage now and it's unfinished. But it was going to be a bunch of first graders. And my thought was I'm going to get them to come up with the story, do the character designs, and then I would do the animation, right?
Yeah.
So my genius idea was I come in, I sit down with the first graders, and I'm like, great, what do you guys want to tell a story about? Crickets. I literally sat with them for an hour, got nothing. The next week I came with flashcards and they said they had subjects, a description, and a location. And just by putting like scared rabbit and angry lion go to space, that created amazing stories, by giving them some sort of box to play in. And so I feel like that was a great learning experience for me of if you can do anything, then you don't know what to do. But if you're limited, there are constraints on you, and sometimes the greatest things come out of that.
What was it like being in the office, being at the studio, and the word came around of, let's do a feature?
It was exciting, and we really had no idea what we were doing, which was kind of part of the fun. None of us had really even worked on feature films of any kind, hand-drawn or whatever. So we got together. I remember we had this offsite, and there were maybe 30, 40 of us, maybe less, 25, something like that. We came up with a whole plan of how we thought we were going to do it. And it's hilarious to look back at today because, it's like one guy is going to do all the layout. We're going to have probably 5, 6 animators because we were optimistic. We had no idea. Of course, we ended up with 27. Today we have in the range of 50 to 100 animators on a feature. So we didn't know what we were doing.
What kind of memories come to mind when you look back at that first mad rush of making that first film? What kind of things come to your mind?
It was like a bunch of guys making, it was an extension of school. This building we were in was we rented, and it was not super fancy. It was like, scuff marks all over the walls and chips in the paint and things like this, and a literal kind of a warehouse in the back. And so it was just a bunch of guys goofing around, having fun, and it felt like the fact we were getting paid was like bonus because I felt like we would be doing this anyway. It was fun, and we goofed around with each other, and we really did a lot of collaborative filmmaking. Making your own films is amazing and I love, but it is fairly solitary. And there was a new muscle that I needed to exercise, this idea of collaborating with other people and taking ideas that come out of the group and building on it and shaping it. And that has really continued. I think so many things we had no idea, of course, making Toy Story, but it really shaped what Pixar is today.
In what kind of specific ways has it shaped the rest of Pixar?
I worked on Story, and then the idea was Andrew Stanton, who was also working in Story, because everybody was working in Story, he and I would go and become the supervising animators, because we were, at that time, you couldn't find computer animators, really. There were only very small numbers, so we had to train everybody. Andrew and I and John were the only ones with experience on the computer. So the idea was he and I were going to go and become the supervising animators. Of course, Story, again, in our pie in the sky view of this, we were going to come up with a film, figure out the story, finish the story, lock it, and then move forward into production. The reality, of course, is the story is a complete mess all the way up until nearly the very end, and you're constantly shaping, reshaping. So Andrew stayed in Story while I went to animation and worked with all these animators coming up. And John, in those dailies, I always figured, the way it would work is we'd show our work, we'd all be quiet, and John would say, change this and give me a little more overlap here and so on. No, the way he worked it was like he just turned to everybody and go, well, what do you guys think? And everybody would start kind of commenting. I think if it was a little quicker, Woody would feel more this, or I disagree, I think he should be slower because of blah, blah, blah. So it became a real discussion, and we all learned because of it. And then at the end, John would say, great, so here's what we're going to do. And he would summarize so you wouldn't leave confused. You would go away knowing exactly what you need to do. Even though the directors get a lot of the credit, it's really a small team and eventually quite a large team of people who contribute mightily to this thing. I mean, the director is kind of shaping and guiding, but it's not that, most of the stuff that people say they love about the films that I've directed, other people came up with that stuff.
Sure, yeah.
And I just kind of recognized that it was great and put it in and helped kind of shape it and cut the stuff that doesn't quite work and so on. So it's really a very collaborative place, and that came directly from Toy Story and directly from John. And we've tried to continue that since.
So right before you guys started working on Monsters, Inc., you, in real life, became a father for the first time. How did that experience influence Monsters, Inc.?
I was a guy who loved going to work. I warned my wife, look, before we got married, I'm going to be there a lot of hours, so I hope you're okay with that. And she would actually come after dinner. She would come back to work with me while I was animating on Toy Story because, during the day I would work with all the other animators. I would only have time to do my own stuff at night. So she would come and play video games, and then go to sleep, and I'd wake her up at 2 a.m. and we'd go home. So it was a very kind of work-centric life for me. And then we had this kid.
Yeah.
And, of course, the kid's at home, and you're like, I want to be with the kid, but I want to be at work. And that really became kind of the central focus of that film, Monsters, Inc., is this guy who loves his job, and now, of course, it's more more to it than what I was describing with because their kids are illegal and toxic and all this. But it was that central kind of understanding of my world is changing and my priorities in life are changing. So it really contributed mightily to that film.
What was the reaction like for you to see audiences react to Up when it came out?
I remember the opening night, Jonas Rivera, producer, and I went around. I think we went to 5 theaters. We'd go in, we'd watch about 20 minutes, and then we'd sneak out and go somewhere else just to see, A, how many people are going, B, how do they react, and so on. And what's great is, of course, the married life sequence is pretty early in the film. So I would sit and look down the aisle, because I don't really watch the movie. I'd seen that enough. But I'd watch down the aisle and see how people are reacting, and I'd see a lot of eye wiping, rubbing of noses and things. And that was really cool because there was some worry. It's an animated film. The characters are very stylized. Gee, was that the right decision? I always felt it was, but sometimes from certain camps, people were like, oh, it's got to be more realistic if it's really going to capture people's emotions. I don't believe that, but it was a great day.
As a fan of animation, I immediately honed in and loved the square design of Carl, the round design of Russell. I think we see similar things in Inside Out with the character of Anger, with all these different shapes. How important is that level of character design to you, those sort of silhouettes and those shapes?
I think it's what animation does so well is this idea of caricature and eliminating details and strengthening, turning up the volume on what it is that is at the heart of the character. Ricky Nierva, who did a lot of the designs on Up, really pushed that sense of squareness, but just enough softness. And, Carl was a heck of a, I know Dave Mullins, who is one of the directing animators on the show, he worked tirelessly to get the sense of wrinkles and folds and things that happen naturally in a face, but make it still true to that sort of square, that design that we were looking for.
Well, beautiful character designs in Inside Out. Absolutely wonderful. But we got to talk about that Up sequence in the beginning. What was it like for you and your team to essentially develop that sequence, pitch it even? Was it something that you knew, this is uncharted territory for Pixar up to this point? Or was it business as usual and you guys were just going, yeah, we haven't had an opportunity to tell a story like this, and this absolutely makes perfect sense?
We sort of backed into it. So the origin of the story of Up was the house floating away. And there was something about that just felt like, oh, yeah, I want to get away from my life a lot of times. I just am sick of people and I just want to float away by myself. And yet, obviously, that's not what I want in the end. And so that's kind of where the story started. But that image needed a lot of setup and explaining, like, why is this man floating his house? Why isn't he just taking the train or an airplane or something? There's got to be a good reason why the house needs to float away. And so we went back to create this whole setup, a promise that he had made to his wife that was unfulfilled. And we initially scripted all that out. We didn't mean to, but it was about 15 minutes worth of stuff between Carl and his wife. And it was very sweet and charming, and it was emotional, but it was way long because it's only after she passes away that the movie starts. So we needed to kind of shorten that. And that's where Ronnie Del Carmen, who is our head of story, he took that on and he kept saying, I think this would be kind of cool if it was a silent thing, if there was no dialogue. And of course, Bob Peterson and I had written it, mostly Bob. And so we were kind of in love with the script that we had, and we were a little reluctant, but in the end, he prevailed, and it was, he did a fantastic job with it.
You've talked about how you don't want your films to feel as if they're preachy, to feel as if there's an agenda being pushed. How do you guys go about finding these messages? Are they baked right into this initial concept, or is it something that as you guys go along, you go, I think this is this universal truth that it's okay to be sad, and then you sort of continue to develop on that?
It's usually something that comes from the director, I would say, and then, of course, the core team embraces it and really finds how to do it, because it's one thing to say this idea, but it's another thing to actually put it into play. As I approach films now, I'm really looking for it, this idea of what is it about, what in my life, even though what you're going to see on the screen are monsters or bugs or cars, what what can I see up there that resonates with it, that seems true for me, so that when I'm watching, I'm up there on the screen. You know what I mean? I project myself in what that character is doing. And so that's a very intentional thing that we're searching for at the very start of a project. Sometimes it's a little bit like a weird dream or going to therapy or something where, like, I don't know, something is intriguing about this. I'm just going to dive in and start to figure it out. And it sometimes takes a little while before you do.
There was a moment that you had of doubt while you were developing Inside Out, when you were maybe thinking that the story wasn't quite working, when it was joy and fear, I believe is what it was. But I really want to ask you about this, and I want to make sure that, that people have an opportunity to hear that it's not always just, oh, yep, we got it, perfect, it's good to go.
Yeah, I think doubt and uncertainty are essential parts of this whole thing, that you have to kind of question at every phase, is this working? I don't know. And kind of folded in with that is the long-standing belief that we've had ever since I've been here, that I think Ed Catmull and John Lasseter talk a lot about, is it's not going to be right the first time. So I remember as a kid, I just had this idea that people were geniuses, like Chuck Jones or Walt Disney, and they would just have these brilliant flashes, and it would be in their head. The whole thing would appear, and they'd put it down, and like, oh wow, I want to be a genius. Yeah. And of course, the truth is, and this is true even of Miyazaki, who I admire and love his work. But I was lucky enough to have a chance to talk to him several times, and he's the same, where you start with something and then you build on it and scrap something and tear this up and add something else. And it's a messy, long process of iteration and reiteration and doing it over and over and over and over. So first of all, that's just like it's a little bit like knowing how the magic trick works, because I think a lot of us want to believe, wow, it is magic. That guy is a genius. And they are. All those guys that I've mentioned are geniuses. But part of the process is doing it over and over and over. And I think the story you were talking about, for me personally, it's the doubt and uncertainty that drives a lot of this, because if you come up with something and you're like, wow, that's great, which sometimes you think, you're totally in, and that's normal and fun, but then unless you question it at every turn, you're probably going to end up with something fairly mediocre, is the truth.
How has your storytelling evolved with the technology advancements that have happened at Pixar?
Well, technology is always inspiring what we have going on. I think John was really wise early on Toy Story. I remember a specific thing we had. I think it was Andy wearing a raincoat, and then we had another gag or an element when Woody had his forehead burned by Sid with the magnifying glass. He ran over and dunked it in a bowl of old dog water, and a big splash, and it was gross and stuff. And we were like, gee, are we going to be able to do this technically? And John said, don't worry about it. Don't think about technology. Just put the story together the way it needs to work. And then later we would go through and say, gee, it's going to be really hard to do the splash of water. It's going to be really hard to have Andy wearing a raincoat. How can we adjust this, not compromise the story too much, but still get what we need out of it? Of course, in the case of the dog water, we ended up with like a bowl of Fruit Loops. So you don't actually see the water in there. We just had to hand animate some little pieces of cereal, and it still worked. So we've never let the technology kind of limit us. Of course, we also work at a company full of computer geniuses, so.
Pixar's known for doing great sequels. Sequels are a common thing in Hollywood, but you guys do it right, a lot of people would say. What are personally your thoughts on sequels?
Sequels are equally difficult. The original films are very hard because you're creating not only these characters but entire worlds, and you have to make sense and all this. But then sequels are coming along, and you're inheriting all this stuff that you designed for the original film, which may not be what you really want for this sequel. In other words, this character has been designed in the case of let's just take Woody. So Woody was designed to be a very kind of, his trigger at the beginning is when Buzz shows up, he realizes, I want to be the favorite toy. He's very selfish. And along the way, then he grows and becomes selfless to the point where he's willing to sacrifice himself so that Buzz can get back to Andy. He realizes what's really important in his life. So now we go to Toy Story 2. where do we start? Like Woody has already gone through his arc, right? So now what does he learn? Well, we have to create something else. And as we do it, we're like, you're kind of shackled a little bit. You're held back by the stuff from the first one. A lot of times, and in fact, even some people have discovered this on MU. I think it was in a teaser, or maybe it's in that walk to work sequence where Mike says something like, "You and I have known each other since kindergarten." And in Monsters, we tried a lot to make them meet in kindergarten, but it just did not work in the story. We wanted to see them meet as roommates at school, and so we chose to ignore that. But that's an example of the kind of stuff that can really get you into trouble.
You're a member of the senior creative team at Pixar. Now, what exactly does that mean?
Well, it sounds fancy when you say that, senior creative, but it's actually, again, kind of like, I don't know, we sit around and talk about ideas. And sometimes we're in and other times we're not, depending on the stage of production and the director and all of this. But in a perfect world, I think what the benefit to the film with this is that they're not executives. They're people who have made and are currently working on their own film, but they're not so deeply entrenched to be able to see, they can see the forest for the trees. So when I'm in here, I'm working on a film and I'm, so close to it, and I've worked on it for months and months, sometimes years, I'm not able to see it as a fresh audience member. So we screen it and we have that, we have that group come in and take a look at it. And then they are able to give us honest feedback and criticism and suggestions. So these guys, they're giving ideas that they can see in their own heads. So they're thinking as filmmakers. It's actually usable stuff. And they're being honest because if my film does well, they benefit as well. So, because we're all working at the same company. So there's not this sense of competition. I want to make mine better. I'm going to secretly sabotage yours or anything like that. So it's a pretty ideal setup.
What is the most essential element to a Pixar film? If you can boil it down to one sentence, what is the most essential thing for you as one of the original Pixar guys?
Relationship. So that may or may not make sense. But to me, at the key, like most people talk about story as what happens next. And I think that's important. But really, what I'm more interested in, I think people are generally more interested in, is the relationship between two characters. That's what ends up changing the character. That's what makes you lean forward and connect and love the characters. It's the relationship that characters have with each other that drives everything. And it's also the most difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Up was the first released 3D Pixar film, and I wanted to ask what kind of challenges you faced on Up, and since then, Monsters, Inc. has been a converted re-release for 3D Blu-ray. The first two Toy Stories have as well, and every Pixar film since Up has been released in 3D, and I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts, some of the challenges and some of the surprises with working on a film in the 3D world.
I think 3D is one of those things that kind of splits people. Either you're a fan or you're not. John Lasseter is a huge fan. I think he even has pictures of his weddings, his wedding taken in
3D cameras,
camera.
Yeah.
And it really makes sense. It plays to the strength of computers, computer graphics, the way we treat it anyway. It's a model. It's like a dollhouse, so you can see it three-dimensionally very easily, or relatively easily. There are still choices to be made, creative choices, which those guys do a fantastic job with. But there are some challenges. I mean, some things like framing. Like if a character is in front of the movie screen and then they move their hand down or turn their head or something and they're cut off, suddenly it looks as though they're behind the screen that they're supposed to be in front of. And it's a weird thing that messes with your brain. It can be, and this is maybe why some people don't like it can be kind of nauseating if it's two-dimensional. If some of the moves that are fine in 2D make your stomach kind of start to do flips in 3D.
Sure.
So there's a lot of things. I mean, for me, I think in a perfect world, if I were going to do a 3D film, I would just embrace it 100% and try to create the camera work and everything for that. Because of the way things are, I usually don't even think about the 3D. I'm more of a fan of traditional cinema myself. And so I use then the amazing team that we have to translate that and interpret it best they can when it goes into 3D.
You've collaborated with the genius Randy Newman on Monsters, Inc., creating the music for that film, the genius Michael Giacchino on Up and Inside Out. How important is music to film, to your guys' storytelling?
Absolutely key. Music has been an integral part of animation since there was sound. The things that Carl Stalling and Disney did in some of those early silly symphonies, and it's just been part of what animation, how it works. And it makes sense because it's a time-based thing. It's a temporal medium. So, you're thinking about the timing, and it becomes such an emotional part of the thing. So I think that's what both Randy and Michael are brilliant at, is capturing. I don't know how you do this. Can you imagine? Okay, it's your job to go away
I can't.
and create music from nothing that makes people cry or makes them feel like they're on the edge of their seats. I don't know how those guys do it. Michael Giacchino has a great story of working with Brad on Incredibles, and he said, listen, Brad sits Michael down. He says, listen, you have the power to ruin my movie, so don't screw it up.
I'm really looking forward to Coco. Is there anything that you can say about that? Did you have a chance to work on it at all? What can you tell us about Coco?
It's a beautiful film. It looks amazing. It's Harley Jessup who did production design on Monsters we talked about earlier, as well as a number of other things, Ratatouille. So it looks fantastic, but more importantly, again, it's got that great sense of relationship. The characters work, and it's very emotional, very emotional.
Was there ever a point where Toy Story 4 wasn't going to happen? Or was it always kind of like, back door's still open, we might do something with it?
I think a lot of us sort of assumed that it was done, the Toy Story was done after 3, because it had such a beautiful closure to it all. And we were very nervous even talking to ourselves. John and Andrew and I kind of swore secrecy about this until we felt like, okay, is there something there? So we just wouldn't even scare other people at work. We just kind of talk about it on our own behind closed doors until Andrew came up with something that felt like, oh, this has got something. And then we started moving forward. And, we understand it's with great trepidation that we move forward on this. I mean, these are characters that people really love, and we're working our hardest to make sure that we're bringing people somewhere new and doing something that you have not seen already on the first 3.
What is something that you would tell yourself, your 21-year-old self, a piece of advice that you would give yourself first starting out?
I would say draw more, because I'm always frustrated by my lack of ability to very quickly put something down. Man, we have these story people here who do not play Pictionary against them, because you will be taken down. And they're really fast. They just can sketch anything. And even if you're working in CG, you're going to have that on the screen. You will never regret being able to draw, because it's the way you communicate with people. You just like sit here and sketch something. Can you make the shot more? I was thinking more of a down view like this, and there it is. And I think the other thing is just do it. There's a lot of times when you feel a little bit scared that maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm just, what if this sucks, And it might suck, but I think that's the only way you're ever going to make headway. It's the only way you're going to learn is by putting stuff out there and doing it. It's, the analogy of I've said before is like you would never give a kid who'd never played the violin before an instrument and say, you're on Carnegie Hall tonight. It would be stupid. You have to practice for years and years and years, and making your own films and doing it over and over is the equivalent of that. Just practicing.
Beautifully said. Well, Pete, thank you so much for coming in today. This was lovely. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Well, thanks, Hector. It was nice talking with you.
Well, we hope that you guys enjoyed our conversation with Pixar mastermind Pete Docter as much as we enjoyed having it. Huge thanks to Pete for sharing some of his time and his insight and sharing the Pixar perspective on the thing that we love so very much, which is just animation, period. Guys, if you don't want to miss an episode of the Nickelodeon Animation Podcast, we make it easy for you. Just go to nickanimationpodcast.com for all of the old episodes and a bunch of cool behind-the-scenes stuff. Thanks to the awesome crew who puts this podcast together. This podcast is produced by
Jonathan Highlander,
Dana Vasquez-Eberhard, Kelly Smith,
Andrew Hubner,
original music by Useful Creatures. This week's episode edited by
Josh Caldwell,
Jonathan Highlander.
all of the incredible social media for our podcast is made by
Narbe Manassians,
Sammy Armiger,
David Watson,
and thanks to the man who works the controls and makes me sound better than I have a right to,
Manny Gralva.
Until next time, thanks for listening to the Nickelodeon Animation Podcast and keep watching cartoons.